So here we are. It's Marcus again. I'm going to indulge in a little bit of thinking across weeks 1 through to week 3. So I'm going to share screen and see where we end up, hey? So I'll go there. All right, so here we are. Thought bubble, as I'm calling them, seeing as we're not supposed to be giving lectures anymore. Yeah, so it's week 2. Tony is going to be with you for all tutorials for the next 4 weeks. But I'll keep on putting up these thought bubbles, particularly because, of course, I'm thinking about you in your first assessment item, the blog, okay, on objectivity. Let's have a look. Okay, first of all, I just had to start off with a little bit of humor, okay, with Charlie Brown and co. Where having a library card, having access to these things, books everywhere, surrounded by them, you know, this is my citizenship in the land of knowledge, okay? You also have that same citizenship, and I hope you take advantage of the course readings, which are just the tip of a massive iceberg. I mean, the history is a discipline of reading and writing, so it's an invitation to you just to follow your nose, get articles, collect articles as PDFs, but collect these beautiful things called books, either as PDFs, as audio books, or as actual hard copy. I often have an audio book. I'm looking at 2 right here that I have as audio books, but I also have them as hard copies, so I can flick between them. I might be listening to something as I'm driving down to the uni, and suddenly they'll say something that I think, oh, far out. That's just what I've been looking for. And, I can go and grab it off my book or from one of the books at the university library. So I just want to remind you that, citizenship is not worth the paper it's printed on unless we enact it. So in the citizenship in the land of knowledge, okay, it needs to be enacted. You need to take responsibility for that citizenship, for belonging to the land of knowledge, okay, which is a human and more than human world, in my opinion, at least, because there are more than just book texts, printed texts, of which I'm surrounded, of course, because I'm a cultural being, but because, the DNA, nature itself, a leaf, a flower, a fruit, an animal, a bird, they are all messages to me. And it requires me to focus my intellect, my listening, my heart on those things. I know I'm waxing a little bit eloquent here, or verbose, you might be thinking, not eloquent. But that's really where I sit. And it sort of helps me hold the layered worlds together, okay? And of course, I drink my tea while I'm doing so. All right. First of all, great book, Evidence and Meaning. All right. This is your week 10 reading, one chapter from this particular text. I quote from it at the beginning and here, and I give Rurston the last word. Why? Because I think he's given more thought than many to the questions that we're dealing with around truth, objectivity, and so on. So from this book, not the reading for this week from Rurston, okay, we have the following observation: that the scientific character of historical studies comes down to its claim of truth. Truth, historical truth. We know that James Cook did this. We know that, Adolf Hitler did that. We know that Mao Zedong did this. We know that Baudelaire or, Marie Curie did X and Y, okay? We know these things. Why? Because they happened in the past. They've been recorded. There's evidence for them and so on. But which truth is meant here? If I mention the name Baudelaire or Boudica to you, and you're a classical historian, a historian who's read your Livy and whoever else from that period, you might you can see that Baudelaire is an enemy of the Roman Empire. She rebelled in the 1st century AD or ACE, Okay, she was a queen of the Iceni peoples tribe in a Celtic tribe on the island of Britannia, and so on. And you can sort of start layering all this stuff in. This is sort of like historical narrative. It's what I call historical literacy. Do you know who Boudica was? Okay, do you know why she got annoyed at those bloody Romans? You know, and so on. So there is this thing, this truth is meant here. What kind of truth is it? Was she a good woman, a nice woman? Would she have made me a cup of tea? Of course not, because there was no such thing as tea back then. But would she, no doubt, as a well-bred Roman and Celtic queen, princess, I was going to say, and then queen, you know, she would have followed certain etiquettes. You know, if someone like myself had showed up, given of course that I could speak the language and all the rest of it, she would have presumably given me at least a hearing. You know, I wouldn't have been just sort of thrown into a pit and left to sort of die or anything like that. She was bound by traditional methods of hospitality, all right, as was all the ancient world in that time. But that hospitality, if I was a peasant, I would have had hospitality from a peasant. If I'm an academic, which in their terms might mean druid, or it might mean wandering wizard, or it might mean just, you know, a knowledgeable person of the upper class, because of course I'm literate and blah blah blah. You know, I would have been offered guest status by somebody of my equal status. Okay, so let's see where he goes with this. So, but which truth is meant here, he asks. In order to answer that question or this question, we need to address the foundation of historical thinking in the real world, or in its anthropological roots. Okay, the real world, the anthropological world, the world in which history performs certain functions, has certain effects on the world. The validity claims, that's the truth claims, that always come up when we deal with our experience of time and difference between past and present through narrative, should be identified. So the validity claims that always come up when we deal with experience of time, across time, through time, how, you know, what does time even mean? And difference between the past, something that's already gone. Okay, we cannot in any way grasp the past. We might hold elements of the past in our hands, an old rock like this one, which is one of those, it's a very small thunder egg, okay, from down on the Gold Coast. But it's old, okay, but it is still in my present. I'm not in its present. Its present is a much longer, slower process, okay, than mine. I'm aging. That rock will look the same, and almost certainly as on the day that I die. All right. So we've got this context of thinking and the experience of time and difference. All right, is something he's talking about in this narrative. So it is this narrative that helps us form meaning. Okay, so history is about meaning. Okay, that provides orientation and allows us to bridge the gap between the past and the present. Okay, so when we had our seminar, I mentioned that Vladimir Putin was spruiking a certain kind of history to justify the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the Russian invasion. In the past, white Australians have used a white Australian colonialist history to justify our invasion of this country and colonization of this country, and so on. So we can see that meaning is temporally located. Okay, it's got anthropological or real world roots. We want to do something. Putin wants to seize the Ukraine and make the Ukraine part of Mother Russia, we might call it. Okay, and it has real world repercussions, because of course people are dying as a result of this narrative. Let's keep moving and have a look and see where we go with that. So particularly, I particularly like Merson's breakdown of historical consciousness. I think it's particularly useful for understanding how to reach a certain slice of the population, a certain group of the population who might be traditional in their consciousness or exemplary or critical or genetic. Where do these people sit? Where do I sit? I sit between the critical and the genetic, but, I certainly enjoy my traditional exemplary history. Boudica was, she rocked in some respects. Wasn't a particularly nice person, mind you. I don't think, being able to just go and kill hundreds of people without any sense of discrimination, women, children, the lot, without any sense, of other than outrage, and, her own honor had been compromised by the Romans. So let's see, where do we go? So we have this. If you're an educator, if you're going to teach in a school, you would do well to keep those 4 categories in your back pocket, because most students that you're going to experience in those contexts are going to have traditionally exemplary expectations. Most of your colleagues who are not historians are going to also be traditionally exemplary. Okay, the curriculum is going to demand of you traditional, exemplary, and probably critical as well. It won't be particularly aligned with the genetic. I'm not going to break that down. I'll let you do that in your workshops with Tony. But it is definitely, I say this, underline it, definitely well worth you returning to again and again across this course. Ask yourself, where do you sit? What elements of the traditional, the exemplary, the critical, and the genetic do you individually feel attracted to? Okay, here we have, and that scan is taken from this book again, which I'm being attacked by Mary Beard, who is a fantastic Roman historian, Women and Power, a manifesto. So yeah, this comes from this book, chapter 8. And I want to make this point: where we sit in terms of consciousness, that goes back to this lot here, or traditional, critical, exemplary, critical, genetic, okay. Where we sit shapes how we understand and configure historical objectivity. It is really important to understand that historical consciousness is going to determine how we describe the objective world that history is purportedly dealing with. Or it may be history is just narrative, like Inge Clendenin talks about. So what does Royston have to say about this? Well, in the reading this time, I thought I should use the reading, hey? It is change itself that gives history its meaning. This comes from his unpacking of that genetic. I flick back to this one here, the genetic. In other words, that there is an evolutionary dimension to consciousness and to narrative, and that just because certain promises or certain things were, on the wall of a castle about familial honor relationships, if that remains static, it remains very much in the critical, in the traditional and the exemplary. And it's only when you start to unpack it through the critical and to give it a new feature, a new trajectory, that it becomes genetic. Okay, so it's an understanding or an appreciation of the change process itself. Okay, so Royston brings the genetic and evolutionary dimension to historical consciousness. Now, this is, of course, of real interest to somebody like Inge Clendenin, okay? And of course, it's all actually thinking, it's also what Fernando Zamesto spends most of his chapter talking about, is this tussle in Western historiography between thinking of the world as change on the surface, but everything stays the same underneath, or everything is always in change, in a process of change. Fernando Zamesto writes beautifully about that. I hope you could appreciate the reading just for what it was, sort of like an overall narrative of the tension between those two forms. And he concludes by saying, look, we've got the humanities on one side and the natural sciences on the other, and that this tension between these two is part of the problem that historians need to deal with today. Some of that links to, in my mind at least, the fact that historians today are being invited to be multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary. They are no longer historians who just go and read, ancient documents, ancient articles, and so on. And to understand the past, they must collaborate with people in other sciences, the social sciences, as well as the hard sciences, you might call them, so that ancient DNA becomes just as important to their work as anything they might find in a book of some kind, whether it's an ancient book like, an early manuscript of St. Augustine or whoever it might be. So this is where I jump from the primary readings across into the extra readings. I've placed this one at the very top currently. We used to have Elton as a core reading, but as I keep finding and reconfiguring things, I move these guys around. But I wanted to point out that Elton offers us a mid-20th century, really solid, hard-nosed, I'm a practicing historian. There's Elton, okay. Elton wrote, I had to read Elton when I was a lad in doing my undergraduate, because he was, or is, a great historian of the English period, particularly of the Tudors and of the emergence of the parliamentary democracy that characterizes still in many respects Great Britain's, I guess, legal and political system. So Elton was particularly concerned with this question of method and truth. So he makes the following point. It follows from this that the historian's study is capable of concerning itself with a truth which is more absolute than mere truthfulness. Now, how paradoxical is that? Verifiability is the enemy of objective truth because it consists of the operation of the observer and the experimenter. In other words, it's very subjective upon the subject matter studied. The historian cannot verify. He, and he was writing in the mid-20th century, so it's not a she, he can only discover and attempt to explain. Discover and attempt to explain. It's another approach to truth, okay, that he's offering us here. He goes on to say, in the work of that discovery, the historian has the assurance that they are looking for something that once had existence and is therefore, in theory, discoverable. So he's recognizing that there is a past, and that past is no longer accessible to us in any direct sensory way. And he gives us an example. We may not know precisely why William the Conqueror decided to invade England. We do know that he did invade and had a reason for doing so. Okay, we may argue over his invasion and its motives. That's really what historians are doing. They're interpreters, you could say, of events from the past, but we cannot argue them away. In other words, we can't say they didn't happen. This, of course, is where Evans comes in when in his analysis of David Irving's work. 900 years ago, they had existence. In other words, William the Conqueror existed 900 years ago. Okay, and just because they are irrecoverable in the flesh now, they are indestructible in the past reality. Past reality. In other words, we know that certain individuals, Nefertiti, Amenhotep, Christopher Columbus, Henry VIII, we know that these individuals all existed, not just those individuals, but we also know that the Black Death occurred, that the Mongols, had the largest land empire we've ever seen on the planet, and so on. Contiguous land empire of the Great Britain of Queen Victoria was the largest empire the planet has seen so far. Unless you want to, talk about McDonald's being an empire at a covert empire or something like that. Okay, so we know that there was this past reality that existed, according to Elton. Thus, while history will rarely be able to say this is the truth and no other answer is possible, it will always be able to say this once existed and took place. the Norman conquest, the invasion of the British of Australia, and so on, that these things took place, and therefore there is a truth to be discovered if only we can find it. And he continues, and this is the clincher, the top of the next paragraph. Whether the truth of these past realities is in fact discoverable is a question that shall be discussed later on in his book, because I took it from a book. So far, I have been concerned only to deny the charge that because the past can't be reenacted, therefore there is by definition no such thing as historical truth. Now, for Elton, there is an absolute historical truth. That historical truth needs to be separated, as he says up here, from truthfulness. We might be able to say that William the Conqueror knew that his grandfather or granduncle, I think it was actually, had King Canute had, placed him in line, you might say, to be one of the contenders for the English crown. But he also knew that England was an incredibly wealthy and rich asset. He was having to deal with the French king, and that the French king was a little bit of a slippery customer. He wanted something very squarely that he could say, this is my own, and I don't, what's the word? I'm not going to be a vassal, in other words, subservient to anybody else in that context. So to become the King of England, it was a gamble. There was no reason why he could have been convinced that he was underscored going to win, but he knew that the odds were in his favor, and that he was just going to out General Harold Godwinson, who was had made himself King of England just months before the invasion of the Normans. And so, I could go on and on with the narrative here, but there's this thing. So there's truthfulness and there's historical truth. William, Duke of Normandy, invaded England in 1066. He was fortunate enough to win the Battle of Hastings. He was strategic enough to hang on to the moral high ground and also the physical high ground. He killed a lot of people over a period of time to ensure that he was going to be the next King of England. All right, that's what Elton is on about. So then this is a week 3 reading, the Lukács reading. I really like Lukács writing again in the mid 20th century. You can see the bottom, the date there, 1968. Any slice of the past can be rendered in an account of fantasy. Okay, it can be, an imagined reality, and this is where Inge Clendenin is coming from. But no one would call that history. This does not mean that the difference between the historian and the writer of fantasy is that between objective and subjective representation. Maybe you can see where I'm going here. The historians and the fantasy artist, the novelist, in other words, or the poet, mental and imaginative capacities are the same order, meaning that the thinking processes of both are engaged in a kind of reconstruction. A narrative reconstruction, a meaning reconstruction, a logic, a causality reconstruction. Okay, around subject matter that's received, you could say, by the senses in immediate, so that's immediately involved. That reception, okay, it is only that the historian's subject matter is limited to certain realities. The historian cannot make up some story about William the Conqueror. It can't just invent it as an excuse. Whereas if you're writing a novel about the Norman conquest, you can write anything you like. Okay, this is where people who get upset, a bit like me, I get a bit upset now with the what would I call it? The liberties taken with a timeline. That's the nice way of putting it in shows like the Vikings, which I love the music, I love the kind of sense of the culture that's evoked through that. And I can see there's some, solid reality, historical reality and research going on there. But at the same time, I keep saying, you can't do that. You can't do that. Why? Because there are certain aspects of the historical realities that, are solid, concrete. Okay. And this is this question then that, sits behind this week's readings, all of the readings, and it sort of is framing my thinking about last week and the coming week, week 3, is, can history be objective? Should it be objective? What does objectivity even mean? And some of the quotes that I've tossed at you so far are even problematizing objectivity itself. And the beautiful thing, of course, is that there is no absolute right or wrong answer. Okay. And this is where we go with Inge Clendinen's work, okay, is where she critiques people who talk about the historical imagination as if it's something over there. The historical imagination is bounded, but it is also a moral and ethical tool in thinking about truth, truthfulness, veracity, all those words that have been used so far. But I want to return to this great book by Johan Rosen, okay, with this final quote here. And then I'll let you go off and play with the readings. Okay, the narrative interpretation of events draws on imaginative actualization. In other words, there are lots of gaps, especially 900 years ago, let's say, stay with Norman conquest and William the Conqueror. There are lots of historical gaps around which the historian needs to, offer us conjectures. But those conjectures are not offered in an absence or a vacuum. They are always contextualized. They are always saying, okay, what's the most logical reason a Norman lord from the Duchy of Normandy would decide that he thought it was the odds were good in terms of favorable for a successful invasion of England? Okay, we need to ask those sorts of questions. They are interpretive questions. They are questions that rely on a certain base knowledge, a certain knowledge of the stuff, you could say, and yet also rely on something more elusive, something that calls forth the historian's imagination, or as Rosen would call it here, imaginative actualization. The representation produced by narrative does not simply reproduce the events, but gives them the quality of meaning: traditional meaning, exemplary meaning, critical meaning, genetic meaning, using his 4 categories. This meaning is not simply assigned to them in a constructivist or retroactive manner, he goes on, it develops out of a complex and dynamic context of meaning already present and of meaning yet to come. Meaning yet to come being the genetic, okay? But there is already meaning present. Why? Because I am a cultural being. I have grown up with certain assumptions about the Norman conquest or whatever it might be that we're discussing, that those assumptions sit in the background and frame my own narrative capacity, my ability to imaginatively actualize logic, interpretation, narrative coherence, continuity. In the pre-given context of meaningful daily life, he goes on, the narrated events are not meaningless, but rather are always already imbued with meaning. Why? Again, because we are historical beings. We are cultural beings. Each one of us needs to be doing the work on our own critical ability to distance and assess, to understand, hey, I am sitting within a certain context. I'm a white Anglo-Australian male of a certain age who has experienced certain things and so on. I am far away in terms of age from most of you, my students. So my ability to read and enjoy and engage with historical thinking is going to be qualitatively different. What I'm trying to do is to say, do history, do it legitimately, understand that there are tensions around objectivity, that a purely objectivist history is, 1, an impossibility, but 2, something we aspire to. Now, aspiration goes with perspiration. Then we work on the on the narrative, on the critical unpacking. We do the research, we go to archives, we do whatever is required of us, depending on the temporal interest and the context and so on. But we don't just sit around and make it up. We can't do that. So he goes on. This does not mean that they do not attain their true historical meaning, these events, through narrative, they become true in the sense, and I think that's wonderful, that things become true, that something that can be true for a traditional historian or a traditionalist with a traditional historical consciousness, that might not be true. So this is where we get the history wars. This is where we get all the arguments about, the ethics and morality of of human actions in the past and the present. Okay. So, to continue, he talked about this horizon. So that's coming. They become true in the sense that they become significant for practical life. In other words, they shape the way we live. This is, or that is, integrated and incorporated within the horizon of meaning in daily life. That our daily life is not just today. We think about the future, we think about the past. There is a horizon that is bounded by our life experience, but also by the fact that I have children and grandchildren that will outlive me, that will live maybe 100 years or so into the future, and that I can remember talking to people who were alive, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. That means there is a horizon of meaning there, which roughly covers 2 centuries, 2 tumultuous, intellectually stimulating, riveting centuries. We can complain about the modern world as much as we like, but we can't deny the fact that you and I having this conversation through a third medium, the Zoom recording, is, a remarkable fact, or feat, or both. Okay, so the last sentence, narrative changes the event into a carrier of meaning. So when we're talking about objective or objectivity, and can history be objective, we need to look at the nature of history. It is a narrative of some kind. It is situated within historical consciousness, whether it's traditional or exemplary or whatever, okay? And that it carries meaning, that it actually has a purpose, a function within the realities that you and I inhabit, okay? So, and this inhabiting space, he calls it daily life. Ruskin calls it daily life, okay? And of course, it folds back in. So it is projected and incorporated into the narrative itself. Because narrative is not just a linear thing, it is a folding process of ongoing re-narrativization, you could say, of the historical or the fantastical material that we are all engaged. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. I hope that at least I've tweaked some thinking, and I look forward to, I'm going to record the next one of these next weekend. I'm assuming I'll just go off and have a think for a little while. Hope you enjoy your week. Bye.